Hello, Andrea.
Hi, Joseph. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well as well. I see nice pictures behind you. Where are you?
I am in Pittsburgh, though I am a PhD candidate at UCLA. With everything and the move to virtual, we took the opportunity and decided to lock down here with my family for some time, and I figured that this setting back here would be at least be appropriate for Paradiso 16, in which we
Italian American. Uh-huh.
and so certainly with Dante meeting his ancestor and hearing about his family in this canto, I thought, well, we can have a sort of nice reference to it in the background.
Very fitting, very fitting. I am in confinement in Norwalk, Connecticut, but it's a pleasant confinement in a backyard.
That's good.
Anyway, shall we start talking about this canto? It's Canto 16th of Paradiso.
Right.
And perhaps I would like to ask you, what's your favorite quote from the canto, from which we could start the conversation?
Well, I know in preparation for this, and then you and I talked about this briefly, it does seem to be a somewhat overlooked canto. A lot of the critics just see it as a list of names. And it is perhaps not the easiest canto of the commedia to get through, but I was struck by, I think, what is an overlooked meta-literary quality to the canto. And I think that the basis for that comes out in verses 7 through 9, which is that besi tu manto che tosto raccorce sì che se non sapon di in die lo tempo va d'intorno con le force. So to give some context to this, what happens in the rest of the canto is that we have Dante learning about his family history and the history of Florence, which are both histories that have been washed away by time. And so this is where the act of literary creation steps in to preserve that. And so I think that's at least one way. I mean, we have other sort of meta-literary issues that arise, but that becomes, I think, one of the key ones and one of the most interesting ones to deal with in this canto. I guess on that note, if you know, having given my sense of what counts in this canto, could you sum up the canto in a few words, a few keywords? What strikes you as important here?
Well, before that, I would linger on this quote that you chose, because meta-literary, I agree with that. There is this reference to tailoring, and it is very meaningful in relation to a canto on Florence, and a Florence of which Dante doesn't seem very happy, especially that tailoring industry, merchants, bankers, I mean, it's the object of the canto. Okay, so to answer your question, if I had to sum up the canto in a few keywords, those would be perhaps modernity, purity, and confusion. These are three words that we find in the canto. But perhaps I could say a little bit about the canto and where we are.
Yes, please.
Are in the fifth heaven of the Paradiso. It's Mars, which is linked to warriors of the faith, and it's part of what we could call a triptych, three cantos in which Dante interacts with an ancestor, the great-grandfather Cacciaguida, the founder somehow of the family. And in this canto, apparently doesn't happen a lot, but the reason why I was very attracted by it is that there is a portrayal of current modern Florence, modern in Dante's eye, on the backdrop of Cacciaguida's Florence, and it's a negative parallel between these two Florence. The canto follows with a long list of families, all decayed, and the canto is about decadence of families, cities, languages. And so it's apparently a canto of complaining about current time.
Right.
So to go back to you, do you have other quotes from which we could continue talking about the canto?
Well, sure. I mean, I think if you, one of the things that struck me is precisely that the list of names, certainly, which I suppose is notorious for being one of the more boring parts of the canto, but I think it was Barolini that pointed out that we still know the names. So literature has taken on that function of preserving the cloak and preserving the names so that here we are several centuries later still discussing them. But if we want to make that meta-literary question or expand the meta-literary reflection, there is in verses 13 to 16, as Dante's met, to give some context, he's met Cacciaguida and he addresses him with the honorific voi, which has this whole backstory of coming from the Romans. And in response to that, the poet writes, Onde Beatrice, che era un po' scevra, ridendo parve quella che tossio al primo fallo scritto di Ginevra, which brings us back to, on one hand, Guinevere and Lancelot, so Lancelot du Lac, and then also to Inferno 5. So we have a self-referential moment on the part of the poet, and then also another meta-literary moment going back to a chivalric tradition. And this is a canto. I mean, there's some debate over this, or over these verses rather, as to whether or not Beatrice is sort of ironically warning Dante about pride and family, or if she is, actually upset about this. But I think what sort of struck me is there is a complex play here where you're getting this story in two episodes, and it's also reversed. I think Valesio talks a little bit about this in one of his writings on the subject, where you have, so to go back to Inferno 5, the second part of this episode, which is, of course, where Guinevere and Lancelot kiss in the famous Galeotto fu libro. But here you go back and you actually have the first part of the episode where Lancelot is approaching Guinevere, and there is a lady in waiting with Guinevere who coughs in the midst of this conversation between Guinevere and Lancelot to let Lancelot know that she understands who he is and who his background is, and that he is in fact this lofty knight. So I thought this was sort of an interesting connection that, I'm not sure that I've quite figured out what Dante's doing here, if there's an intentional, some kind of intent here on his part for reaching back to the same episode from Inferno 5, but it is at least as on the part of the poet, a fairly complex creative move here.
Right. Well, as any canto, I guess, of the Divine Comedy, there are sort of infinite connections, conscious or unconscious, to other parts of the Divine Comedy. So perhaps I would go back to those three keywords that I mentioned in the beginning. The first one is the modernity. Modernity is a word that we find at verse 33, when Dante says that Cacciaguida kind of answers his question about the ancestors. Mm-hmm. And he speaks con voce più dolce e soave, ma non con questa moderna favela. That is, so with a sweeter and gentler voice, but not in this modern speech. And here we have the theory of Dante about the language, the transformation of language through the time. So this is a sort of a common theme of the canto, the transformation of things, and also the language transforms. So the language of his ancestor, great-great-grandfather, is already sort of foreign, strange, it's not like the modern speech of Dante. And modern connects to other parts of the Divine Comedy. It's a word that we find, for instance, in Purgatorio 26, when Dante is talking to another father, somehow, although they call each other brothers, is Celli, where Dante says, you are you will be remembered forever until the l'uso moderno, it is the modern poetic style will last. So Cacciaguida speaks in terms that are foreign to the modern language of Dante, even though if they are sweet and soave, gentle. Yet the canto doesn't seem to a modern reader like us sweet and gentle. It's one of the striking cantos, contradictory cantos, if we want, of the Divine Comedy for a contemporary reader. Because if we move to the following terzinas, we find arguments that contradict, if you want, our feelings as contemporaries. In particular, if we go to lines 49, where he talks about la cittadinanza che ormista, the population that now is mixed, was at that time pure. So pure that even the lust of the artisans was pure compared to us. And here is where we find a little bit uncomfortable when he talks about the degeneration of the city and its population caused by what we would call nowadays immigration. Immigration of whom? Immigration of people from the countryside in this case. And Dante here is talking about a huge phenomenon of his time that is the, I think it's called the urban drift. That is the immigration of people from the countryside, low people, to the city. And here Dante doesn't hesitate to express all his despise toward the low people. And here we culminate in line 77 when he says, sempre la confusione delle persone principio fu del mal della cittade. The mixing together of persons, of people, has ever been the beginning of harm to the city, which resonates strangely, no, for nowadays readers, not far from elections. What do you think?
One of those challenges, when you bring Dante into the classroom, I mean, there's a number of famous instances like this, but certainly, if you were to choose Paradiso 16 to teach to a class of undergraduates, say, it is a difficult image. I suppose that if I were to be faced with that challenge, especially, in this very difficult year that we've had, I would also point to, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it is Paradiso 19, so just a few cantos later, where we have Dante bring up the figure of the Ethiopian, whom for him is this foreign non-Christian other, and he suggests that there are Christians who are less virtuous and therefore further from God than this other that for so many would be assumed that it would be impossible for him or for her to be close to the divine. And so I think that you touched on a key point when you talk about the contradiction here. There's this internal tension. There's so much tension that arises, between this Dante that is, perhaps there's a xenophobic quality, this sort of early perhaps regionalism for which Italy is still so famous. You have that question of time and how time is eroding not only history, it erodes language itself. So it's eroding the very basis of the text that he's writing in, of that moderna favela. And yet Dante is also, in this sense, very audaciously creating an entire world that is in theory sustaining itself, right? And yet its very foundation is a language that could be swept away. And so I think you find this just constant tension within the canto that makes it a lot more a lot richer than it would seem at the first impact.
Yeah. And so to continue a little bit on that note of the how can we call that, a sort of odd modernity, if you want, or odd feeling that we get from reading a canto like this, and perhaps Dante in general, is that resonates with our story. And at the same time, perhaps it would be wrong to try to read it through our lenses. Not by chance, his immigrant from the countryside that is, as you said, right beyond the walls of the city. It's not people coming from afar. So the afar is very close for Dante. And at the same time, Florence Dante of Florence time becomes something odd and strange. What for us is Florence, the wealth of Florence, that is the product of commerce, banking, tailor, artisans, people coming from the countryside, bringing new spirits and new entrepreneurship, right. The birth of capitalism. All that for Dante is decadence. So he's kind of looking at history from another side. What for us is the beginning of our history, for him is sort of the end of a route. So Dante is a strange point through which to look at modernity. He is the first one who uses the word modernity in poetry, but perhaps he is not the modern poet somehow. What do you think?
Right. Well, I mean, it was, as you were speaking, I was also thinking of yet another contradiction, which is that Dante is writing this in exile. So he finds himself in the position of the same people that he has criticized for confusing the population of Florence. He, by necessity, must go somewhere else. And I suppose that maybe this is that there is perhaps that key tension to modernity. I mean, that on one hand, the move towards a greater diversity, towards a mixing of peoples. Yeah. And yet that has been a fraught path in very dramatic ways throughout history. And when we're seeing it again in our moment now. And so that in that sense, perhaps he really is, a modern poet precisely because he doesn't resolve the contradictions that we ourselves have continuously failed to resolve, or at least put to rest in any sort of definitive way.
Right. He's looking at our history from the other side of the ocean, if you want. I was thinking that perhaps with this we could end this conversation. He is complaining about people immigrating to the city. And now I find myself very close to the city, that is New York. And now, because of the pandemic, people are moving out of the city to the countryside. So it's interesting to look at reading Dante and see how it doesn't fit, and at the same time, he talks to us. Anyway.
Right. It's been a strangely literary experience in some ways. I mean, thinking of course of Dante, but as soon as this thing reared its head and many people began to leave Los Angeles, where I'm living, and you begin to think of Boccaccio, for example. And my mother actually read I Promessi Sposi for the first time. So it's a moment that is very difficult, but it's I suppose it's been encouraging the way in which people have found a resonance with these wonderful works that sometimes get too ignored in a world that has become so modern that perhaps we've begun to forget the very roots of the modernity we find ourselves in.
Well, it was a pleasure talking to you, Joseph.
It was a pleasure for me as well.
See you soon, hopefully.
See you soon. Take care now.